Star Trek Strange New Worlds confirms a decades-long fan theory and simultaneously delivers us a comedic relief following the traumatic first episode of Season 3. Today we are talking about the second episode of Season 3 of Strange New Worlds, so if you haven't seen it yet, stop this video, save it for later, watch the episode, and then come back and watch this video. But for those of you who have already seen the second episode of Season 3, let's talk about the wedding planner of Gothos. I mean, wedding bell blues. Let's start with the obvious, Trelane. Before the start of the season, there was a lot of speculation among Trekkies about who the Rhys Darby character was going to be, and Trelane was at the top of the list, and we were right. TOS fans will recognize this character from the old episode Squire of Gothos. This character has kind of gone down in Star Trek fame as possibly being a Q. Unfortunately, it was never officially canonized that he was. The closest that we ever came to Trelane being officially recognized as a Q came from Peter David's novel Q Squared, wherein Q says he thinks that Trelane might have been one of his illegitimate sons, but he can't know for certain because he's Q. Since then, Trelane has popped up here and there in a few Trek-related comics that also have Q in them, but it never officially was stated whether or not he was a Q or related to Q until this episode. And now we know for certain with the surprise guest starring appearance of John Delancey as Q in the episode. One of the really creative things that the writers did in this episode was disguise Trelane so that it would make sense canonically for him to show up in the Squire of Gothos and the core Canon TOS crew not recognizing him. So in this episode, we first see him as a Vulcan bartender and then as an Andorian wedding planner. Likewise, at the end, when Q shows up and forces Trelane to let everyone free of their delusion, as Pike puts it, it kind of leaves everybody thinking that maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen, it was all kind of make-believe, it wasn't real, and in the end, they don't really know that it was Trelane. He never shared his name, and so it makes sense for them to canonically go on into the TOS episodes, meet Trelane again for the second time, not knowing it, and be completely unprepared. I think this portrayal of Trelane was definitely more on par with what we know of the Q and the Q Continuum. He definitely acts like a child Q who is just looking to appease and amuse, but also get his way. Like Delancey's version of Q in the older series, we do see that this Q is short-tempered. He is fueled by emotions and driven by feeling as opposed to rational thought. He tries to fulfill Spock's wish without the consideration of other people, and he sees life and all of this as a game and gets mad when people don't play along. But there are also some other fun Q parallels in this episode, particularly with turning Dr. Corby into a dog. As we know, Q also has a history of this. He does turn Dr. Crusher into an Irish setter in an episode of The Next Generation, and he does make dogs appear for Captain Janeway to make her happy. Likewise, there is that scene where Spock wakes up in bed alongside Trelane, which definitely parallels the scene in Tapestry where Picard wakes up in bed with Q. All in all, this was just a really fun and comedic episode that was definitely nice to have following the season premiere, and I think finally confirming this fan theory that Trelane was a Q all along, albeit a young Q at only 8,020 Earth years. But there are a lot of other great aspects of this episode. Spock definitely carries the brunt of the comedic relief in this episode. He has some of the best one-liners that are both funny but also quintessentially Spock. My personal favorite line is when he says to Lon, "The absence of a heart would be quite fatal." But shout out to Captain Patel for having the second best line in the episode, "But where will all of your hair products go?" This is also one of the episodes where we get to see Spock's chest again, and I don't know if anybody else noticed, but it was quite different than the Spock chest of the previous seasons. The hair on his chest was definitely more in line with what we see of Leonard Nimoy in the TOS episodes, so either this is a natural progression of Vulcan growth, or we are trying to be more canonically, physically Spock? Scotty also provides a very lovely lightheartedness to this episode, especially in the scene of Spock's bachelor party where he turns down a drink from Pike and basically says, "I don't drink very much, I barely touch the stuff," and then after tasting the Latrogue immediately starts downing glasses of Saurian brandy. And then at the end of the episode, orders 2 Guinnesses. This is definitely a callback to the original series where we see Scotty, in contradiction to Dr. McCoy, basically kind of trying to hide his drinking or his appreciation for alcohol and spirits. Uhura also has some small shining moments in this episode where we finally see her coming out of her shell, growing into the woman who will become the head lead communications officer on the bridge. It is nice to finally see her actually communicate with people directly as opposed to through her earpiece. And we're definitely starting to see more of that beauty, that shine, that grace, and confidence that Nichelle Nichols put into the character through Uhura's hair, her wardrobe, and definitely her earrings. Speaking of wardrobe, if the costume designer of this episode does not win an award, I will eat a tribble. The outfits in this episode were so gorgeous. I know that everybody is talking about Nurse Chapel's wedding dress, but I really loved Lan's red dress at the end, also Una's dress, everything that Uhura wears from start to finish, including that cute little kind of orange short romper outfit. And I love that tiny little gold embellishment that they added to Pike's green dress uniform, which definitely calls back to the uniform that Kirk wears in TOS. There is a long-standing history of comic relief episodes in Star Trek. This one is just another one added to the list, but one thing that's great about the comedy episodes is we get to see more character development, particularly relationship development. One of the relationships I really loved in this episode was the dynamic between Pike and Captain Batel. We don't often get to see a captain in a relationship in Star Trek, particularly with another captain. So we get to see this dynamic between two captains trying to figure out how they are going to spend their lives together when they are apart. The only ever time we've really seen this is in Lower Decks with Captain Freeman, and then in the beginning of Voyager with Captain Janeway. But I do love that this relationship between Pike and Batel is very adult. It's very of the appropriate age, so to speak, and of their positions in Starfleet and society. I'm worried about them, of course, because we know what happens to Pike, but I am so happy to see a captain in a steady, strong relationship. But of course, one of the great things about Strange New Worlds, which I think they have taken from the original series, is this ability to balance the drama and the comedy. And we definitely see that in this episode with the character of Lieutenant Ortegas. As opposed to Lon, who is finally embracing this new life free of the trauma of the Gorn, we see that trauma now in Ortegas as she is trying to be normal and be herself with this lingering experience that happened from the first episode, and probably also ties into her experiences from the Klingon War. I hope that this change in the character arc definitely gives us the opportunity to see more of Ortegas, learn more about her history along with her brother. And I do have to point out that I am glad that they had that little moment during the final dance scene where Pike notices it. It just proves how good of a captain he is, that he recognizes that one of his crew is in distress. And of course, let's talk about the music. That final song, Wake Me Up Before You Go, because that's of course exactly what Q does. He wakes them up and then he just heads on out to another part of the galaxy, which is definitely on par for a Q.